And we are back with another amazing episode of The Global and the Granite State, a program of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. For those first-time listeners, my name is Tim Horgan, and I am the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire and your host for this series. We continue to center ourselves at the forefront of global conversations and act as a platform for you to better understand the world. By taking the time to engage with these global conversations, you validate the importance of international understanding and show the community that you value fact-based, accurate, and hopefully engaging discussions. I thank each and every one of you for confirming this remains important and valuable. As a community-supported nonprofit, I also want to thank all of our members, donors, sponsors, and supporters for making this work possible. It is through you and because of you that WAC&H can continue to bring these insightful conversations to our global community. You can join our mailing list, donate to the cause, and or become a member by visiting our website at wacnh.org today. Special thank you to McLean Middleton for your generous support of this podcast and the Council in general. Your leadership is an example for all. McLean Middleton is one of New England's premier full-service law firms with over 100 attorneys throughout offices in New Hampshire and Massachusetts. McLean Middleton's attorneys have been providing trusted legal services to businesses throughout the region for over 100 years. Learn more at mclean.com. All right, let's dive right into our conversation on how terrorism ends. What comes to mind when you think of terrorism or terrorists in general? Depending on a wide range of factors from your age, country of origin, political leanings, and other factors, you may have a very distinct or very vague picture of what those words paint for you. Of course, for most Americans born before, let's say, 1995, the first thing that pops to mind is 9/11, Osama bin Laden, al-Qaeda, and the broader war on terror. However, for those in various North African countries, the word terrorism brings to mind raids and kidnappings by the likes of Boko Haram. Sri Lankans are bound to think of the Tamil Tigers, and those from Peru may eventually think of the Shining Path. These all had different formats, goals, ideologies, and strategies, but the thing that ties them together is their use of violence in a way that is designed to create fear, gain attention, and pressure government for change.
Terrorism is a very weak form of violence because it's very leveraged, highly leveraged. So it's small numbers of people in most terrorist groups, almost by definition. And what they're trying to do is increase their ability to recruit, to gain attention, to raise the profile of their cause. Depends on the specific group. You have to read what their goals are because not everyone does all of these things. But mobilization is one of the most important motivations.
I was very excited to speak with Dr. Audrey Kurth-Cronin about her research into terrorist movements and, most notably, how they come to an end. Dr. Cronin is the Trustees Professor of Security and Technology and the Director of the Carnegie Mellon Institute for Strategy and Technology, as well as the author of the 2009 book, How Terrorism Ends, Understanding the Decline and Demise of Terrorist Campaigns, the 2020 book, Power to the People, How Open Technological Innovation is Arming Tomorrow's Terrorists, and the 2024 Foreign Affairs article, How Hamas Ends, a Strategy for Letting the Group Defeat Itself. It was this most recent article that caught my eye for this podcast discussion, as it remains critical that our global community remains committed to understanding that not every policy works for every global issue, and responses must be calibrated. This idea helped drive Dr. Cronin to write her 2009 book in the first place.
So I was working on Capitol Hill, and I was in the Congressional Research Service. I was their specialist in terrorism not long after the September 11th attacks. And so I had to work for 535 bosses. It was a time of extreme high pace. Well, one day they called me to the office of a senior senator. The staff ushered me right in, and I was sitting there, and he said, Audrey, I have been going from briefing to briefing, hair on fire briefers, talking about where the next attack is coming from. I don't know anything about the Middle East. I don't know anything about al-Qaeda. I don't know who this bin Laden guy is. That is not my specialty. He said, I feel like I can't get my feet on the ground. I can't look at this in a strategic perspective. It's all, where are we going to attack next, or where are they going to attack next? Can you help me? And so I said, after a few pregnant pauses, I said, well, the way to think about this is that these campaigns have a trajectory. It might be long or short, and they have different characteristics, and not everything is completely comparable, but they always come to an end, because terrorism is not a very promising vocation. So the best way to think about this strategically is to remember that we have lots of experience, particularly with modern terrorism. We have 150 years plus of experience with that kind of use of terrorism, hundreds of examples of groups that have ended, and there are some classic ways that they end. So if you think about the ways that they end, and then you figure out how a particular group matches or doesn't match each of those ways, you can calibrate your reactions. You can think about what the trajectory is. You may be on the way up. I'm not saying we're close to the end of al-Qaeda. However, to think strategically, you should be thinking about, what does the broader campaign look like, and how can I enable it to end, or at least get out of the way?
After an opportunity to work at Oxford arose, she began thinking about terrorism in a broader and more historical context, looking at the terrorist groups she had studied in the past and how policymakers could apply the right pressures at the right time to hasten the transition of these groups away from terrorism. Now, I will tell you up front that the transition away from terrorism is not always a good one. The option where the group turns into a criminal gang focused on economic gains by any means necessary is maybe not really that much of an improvement. Okay, before we get too far ahead of ourselves in thinking about how terrorist groups come to an end and how as a whole we can speed that process, let's get an understanding of what terrorism is and hopefully help Dr. Cronin in her crusade to debunk the cliche that one person's terrorist is another's freedom fighter.
Okay, so I may not win this war against that cliche, but I've been fighting it for a long time. I've been teaching about terrorism, teaching about counterterrorism, been involved in policy in various different ways, trying to be constructive. I personally think that's a very unhelpful way of thinking about terrorism. There are certain clear aspects of any group that uses terrorism. There are legal aspects to terrorism. You can find them in U.S. title and code. Always, terrorism involves violence. It can't be just words. Some people will call other people terrorists, and that's a loose and frankly very unhelpful use of the term. It has to involve some kind of violence. There has to be some political aim. So it needs to be for some purpose that is beyond just criminality or mental illness, or there has to be a broader political aim. There has to be a target that is an illegitimate target, either a non-combatant or a civilian. The words have slightly different meanings, and different legal definitions use different versions, but it's important that it be an illegitimate target. And there has to be an element of symbolism, which is this side of it that reaches an audience. That's what makes it modern terrorism. Now, we used to have terrorists back in the first century of the Common Era. I'm not going to go back that far. But modern terrorism evolved with the invention of a couple of things.
Pause here for dramatic effect.
And the first one was dynamite was very crucial to the invention of terrorism, because you could have anyone involved in terrorist attacks of any kind of physical stature, but they could throw a stick of dynamite. There were some earlier terrorist groups that used gunpowder, but the big impetus to the global growth of terrorism happened with the invention of dynamite, and it was patented in 1867. So that was a key aspect to it. And you also had, at the latter part of the 19th century, the growth of sensationalized newspapers. So newspapers that could draw from using the telegraph, grow from very small subscription numbers. Many of them got bigger 100 times over, particularly in the United States, the Hearst and the Pulitzer. Those newspapers actually took great advantage of many of the terrorist attacks that were happening globally, beginning in Europe, and used them as a sensationalist way to draw attention and therefore to grow their own subscription base. But also what they did was, with the diffusion of dynamite, they also grew the likelihood that there would be terrorist attacks. And we had terrorist attacks from the mid-19th century through about the 1930s that were on every continent in the world in a very short space of time, very much aligned with the spread of globalized newspapers and with the spread of dynamite. So that's where terrorism became this type of phenomenon. And it always has to have a symbolic aspect because in the modern era, your ability to get your word out, to get the message out, to have some sort of broader symbolic aspect to your violence is crucial to the definition of terrorism.
Okay, so if you can imagine the revolutionary role that sensationalized media played in the first wave of the growth in modern terrorist history, I wonder what people will say about the impact social media algorithms have on its recent proliferation. While many Americans have become less concerned about terrorism as it has morphed into an over-there problem, many in the intelligence communities are signaling alarm at the scope, capabilities, and threats that terrorist organizations present today. Now is certainly the time to make sure the government is doing what is necessary to thwart these threats and bring the groups to an end. However, again, we are not looking at a new trend in terrorism, as there have been peaks and valleys before.
The fact is that terrorism has always waxed and waned. One of the things that makes a big difference is there have tended to be waves of terrorism that are attached in terms of their ideologies, and they also share common tactics. In the last 30 years, the growth of religious terrorism, which began after 1979, but actually peaked starting in the 1990s, and then, of course, with September 11th, and then the growth of radical Islamist terrorism was very much symbolized and marked by the 9/11 attacks, but it hadn't begun then. And so the dramatic response on the part of the United States that was not just against individual groups in many different parts of the world, but also engaged in state-to-state violence as well, in invading Afghanistan and responding to the attacks that came from that territory, and then the war in Iraq. All of that was connected to the global war on terrorism. I don't actually think that this argument that we should go from only focusing on terrorism to focusing on great powers and states, that doesn't make any sense to me because states are sponsoring terrorist groups. The state sponsorship of terrorism was not as prominent during the height of the al-Qaeda era because it had its own transnational movement. But it's not as if Iran went away and no longer had Hezbollah or resources that went to Hamas or the Houthis, and Iran was playing a role in Iraq as well. It continues to in Iraq and Syria. So that has also waxed and waned. We have had state sponsors of terrorism. The classic ones for years were Iran, Iraq, Cuba, Libya, North Korea. Some of those have made their way off of the state sponsors of terrorism list. It's something that I used to work on when I was in the legislative branch, whether the group was on the list or not. There were always a lot of very technical questions about how a state qualifies as a state sponsor. But we are looking at a much bigger threat when it comes to major powers, and that is a difference. But that doesn't mean that there's this sudden era where states are a new thing we have to deal with. We've always had to deal with particularly Iran's sponsorship of terrorism, but also to some degree North Korea and the other states that I described. That is the first thing. We're going back into a much more familiar time in some respects. We're going back to the kind of great powers that we focused on mostly during the Cold War, but there was a huge amount of terrorism during the Cold War too. It's just that it was overshadowed by the fear of nuclear apocalypse, and I think appropriately so.
So perhaps it is more that the public's interest in terrorist attacks has waned and waxed over the years. This can play a role in how terrorist groups actually come to an end, because if your attacks are not bringing you attention and new recruits, well, there's not much of a point anymore. Of course, just simply ignoring terrorist groups and hoping that they go away is not a great strategy, especially if your community is being targeted specifically. In that case, let's dive into the ways that these organizations may come to an end. In studying over 457 campaigns and organizations, Dr. Cronin has identified 6 ways in which these groups cease to utilize terrorist tactics. Those broad categories are success, transformation, military repression, decapitation, negotiation, and in most cases, failure. So, what does each path look like?
Well, we'll start with success. So it is possible for a terrorist group to succeed in achieving its aims. And what success means is that the group achieves the goal that it has set forth as it described it. I define success in my book according to the way the group defines success. And there have been some cases, a relatively small number of cases. For example, Israel, Ergun with the establishment of the State of Israel, always a very sensitive point. But Menachem Begin was very open about the fact that terrorist attacks were used in the founding of Israel, and that history has been very well documented. It was one of the aspects, one of the factors, among others, in Great Britain withdrawing and in the foundation of the State of Israel. The other big case that most people think of is Umkhonto. It was basically the violent wing, the terrorist wing of the African National Congress. And when Mandela took power and when the apartheid state ended, that group technically achieved its aim. But the thing to remember with respect to success is that it always requires some sort of transition where there's governance that rejects the former use of that kind of violence. The terrorist violence is illegitimate violence. And so one of the first things, for example, that Mandela did was condemn what Umkhonto had been doing, not least because Umkhonto's victims were mainly Black South Africans. So that's the first pattern, that a group can succeed, but it's very rare. And the percentage of groups is very, very low, maybe 5%, I believe, is what I found in the book. The least likely outcome, I would say. The second outcome is that a group can transition from using terrorism to become either a criminal group or an insurgency. So that's a transition in two directions. A criminal group usually means that their central motivation is no longer driven by the political aim. So remember, I said it had to have a political end. If all you're trying to do is enrich yourself or build a narco state where you can continue to have that kind of profit, that's one direction that some groups have transitioned. The other direction is toward insurgency. So if you transition toward insurgency, that's a very bad outcome for any counterterrorism campaign. What it means is that the number of people who are involved in a group grows dramatically in the tens of thousands rather than the hundreds. Usually an insurgency is able to control territory, at least temporarily, and it's a direct fight where they can actually target state forces. So state forces are to some degree a legitimate target if you're what some people would consider a freedom fighter and you target state military, that's a legitimate target. So it's not technically a terrorist attack. So that's a second way that a group can reorient. And that's the second big pattern, reorientation. So it's no longer terrorism.
This is what I meant earlier when I said that these options are not always necessarily better than the alternative. It would seem that any policies that would lead to the transformation model where violent activity continues should be avoided. Okay, what's next? Oh, that's right.
The third one is military repression. Military repression is the first go-to for virtually every state. Why? Because a state's primary responsibility is protection of its citizens. And if you have citizens who are killed by a terrorist attack, immediately the state responds in order to regain that legitimacy and to protect its own citizens and to be seen in the eyes of its own constituents as doing so. There's always a sense of retribution too. I mean, it's a kind of a gut reaction, and I deeply sympathize with it. Most states in the world that have had terrorist attacks have started with that kind of overwhelming military oppression, and then they learn. Because what happens in that type of pattern is it's actually quite difficult to stamp out a terrorist group strictly through the use of military force. There haven't been that many cases that have been successful. The Russians against the Chechens would be one of them. But even in that case, when Putin really just threw everything at the Chechen separatists, but then they spread Ingushetia and Dagestan and the broader Caucasus, and we see Chechens associated with some of the Islamist groups in the Middle East. I mean, they have spread. So that's the downside. You can stop terrorism through military repression in one discrete territory. But as that case also shows you, if you really want to just kill everyone, you can do that. And that's basically what the Russians did in Chechnya. The LTTE and the state of Sri Lanka is another case where military repression was used. But in that case, they were able to put so many members of the Tamil Tigers, who were the leaders, into the northeast of that island, as well as a lot of civilians, and just obliterated them. And they killed a lot of civilians while they were doing so. They did crush the LTTE. So it's not that it's never possible, but it's very, very difficult. It's very costly to sustain a campaign of military repression, especially if you're a democratic country. It works best when group members can be separated from the general population. So you have to have some ability to profile or separate who your targets are from who your broad audience is. And it erodes civil liberties consistently. It often strains the fabric of the state. So states become completely different from what they were before they engaged in that kind of repression. Those tactics can really change the character of a society and raise the question of what exactly it is that you're defending, particularly when it comes to a democracy. It can be extremely challenging, not just to all of the thousands of people who are the victims of overwhelming military response, who may not be perpetrators of terrorism, but also to the state that's engaging in them. So a good example here is the Tupamaros in Uruguay, which was one of the most advanced democracies in Latin America. I think the Tupamaros originally, I may not have the numbers exactly right on the top of my mind. You'll find them in the book. But anyway, I think it was like 9 counterterrorism personnel and a somewhat larger number of people 9 were killed and a larger number were hurt, but it was a relatively small campaign. And then the military took over the government with the terrorist campaign as its driving catalyst, instituted martial rule, and the state of Uruguay no longer became what it had been, such an admirable democracy. And it took a while for that to come back. The next common way of terrorist groups ending is through what I call decapitation. And I'm not talking necessarily about taking someone's head off. I'm talking about capturing or killing the leader of a group. This tends to work only in groups that are small and that are hierarchically structured, because if you have to have a hierarchy to get to the leader, and also characterized by a cult of personality. If that's a key part of the ethos of your group, it's going to be a much bigger impact if you have capturing or killing of the leader. On average, those groups have also been quite young, so they've been operating less than 10 years. It's a very specific type of group that ends through that kind of response. Older, highly networked groups, they can reorganize and they can survive. So decapitation strikes are tactically often satisfying to the state or to many of the constituents, but in the long run, they're strategically ineffective because the group can reconstitute from its broader network. There are lots of examples of decapitation. I would say that the Israelis are the best at targeted killing in the world, and they have used decapitation strikes very frequently. And in fact, we just saw this with their strike on a major Hezbollah leader in Lebanon, in Beirut, and their killing of Ismail Haniyeh in Iran. So the Israelis have used decapitation as a very, very important tool. The fifth of the patterns is negotiations. Sometimes those have been successful. We've had negotiations over the Good Friday Accords, which was successful in transitioning members of the IRA into a governing structure. And it also left some groups engaging in criminal behavior. It's not that all of that behavior has ended as of 1998, but it was a successful negotiation. The negotiations over the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the FARC, have been successful. I actually went and visited and met some of the members of the FARC. There are a number of other cases. So the people who negotiate tend to be the longer lived groups. That makes sense because you're not going to negotiate with a group that's only been around for a short time. They may not even survive. Only 18% of groups negotiate at all, according to the research that I did on all those 457 groups. And then the last pattern, which I think is the most common, according to my research, is failure. So most terrorist groups fail. Their average lifespan is quite short, between 8 and 10 years. And most of them fail either because they implode, which includes things like they die out when there's a transition between generations. That happened with the Weather Underground. Or they disintegrate into factions, which happened with the Real IRA, which was one of the factions of the IRA. And the reason why the Real IRA failed was that they had a major attack in a market town, which caused such repulsion, such backlash on the part of the public, that you had both Protestants and Catholics come together during the funeral, and they turned in the Real IRA. It's very difficult if you can't hide somewhere among the population. So anyway, that's implosion. You can fracture over ideological differences. Japanese Red Army did that. Operational disagreements, the FLQ in Canada did that. That's the first big aspect. Fractionation, implosion, infighting, very common. People who engage in terrorism tend not to be having really great social skills. So they tend to not agree on what they're trying to achieve, and sometimes that causes fratricide. But the other, even bigger subcategory is that they lose popular support. And the real IRA goes in this category too. They lost popular support from the people they were trying to attract. The most common way that you can lose popular support is a targeting error, meaning you kill the very people or you hurt the very people that you're supposed to be protecting, or you hurt a target that is seen by your potential constituents as being illegitimate. Targeting errors oftentimes result in that backlash. The real areas I've mentioned. Another major case is the al-Qaeda in Iraq, which engaged in an attack. You'll remember 2005. They killed a lot of people at several hotels in Jordan. It was just a heart-wrenching situation where they killed members of a number of different wedding parties. And there was such repulsion and such outrage in Jordan as a result that al-Qaeda went from huge amounts of support there before this particular attack to an extremely small amount of support. And the Jordanians were very much eager to try to end al-Qaeda. I would say that actually al-Qaeda itself suffered from backlash because most of the people who died as a result of al-Qaeda attacks throughout the world were Muslims, the very people that they were supposed to be trying to attract. And al-Qaeda, bin Laden's al-Qaeda, never became the popular movement that was his ambition because people were so repulsed by the attacks that occurred oftentimes in their own countries.
Okay, so if the research tells us that most terrorist groups fail based on their own internal divisions or because they lose popular support, it becomes more important for governments to devise strategies that will hasten their fall. However, time and again we see governments reaching for the military option first, regardless of the suitability of this tool for the task. So why is it that so many times we see this as the initial response?
Military force is its easiest tool to use and its most powerful tool. And so if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail is the cliche, but basically most governments reach for the military response first because that's the best way and the fastest way to have an overwhelming reaction when there's a major terrorist attack. That's the reason why most governments go for a military response first. The second reason is that terrorism is very much oriented toward that short-term limbic brain, I guess. It's meant to elicit a kind of instinctive reaction. There's an emotional reaction. And so the first thing that any government wants to do is just engage in retribution, revenge, response. It takes tremendous knowledge of history and strategic thinking to be able to be patient enough to build an effective counterterrorism policy or strategy that includes other tools. And it's quite difficult to do. A lot of times you don't get the kind of support from even your population to put the kind of finances into other aspects of a counterterrorism strategy.
While the drive for retribution and for showing force to regain legitimacy as a government dedicated to protecting its people is understandable, wouldn't it be nice if we could rely on political and military leaders to have that tremendous knowledge and history that Dr. Cronin mentioned that would allow them to look critically at the situation and select the right tool, rather than the easiest and most politically expedient? Sometimes it can feel like the only option. How different would it be if the Taliban had initially turned over Osama bin Laden when the U.S. made the demand in the days following 9/11? But, as has been seen time and time again, these wars can be devastating, long, and detrimental to peace, security, and democracy. Now, of course, just because you are undertaking a military campaign against a terrorist group, this does not restrict you from pursuing other options simultaneously.
Other ways of responding include negotiations. that can be extremely upsetting to the victims that have just experienced a terrorist attack. So it's difficult to respond with a negotiation until much further down the road. Sometimes there's back channel negotiating that's required by any responsible government to have some sort of ability to gather intelligence, if nothing else. But it tends not to happen in the beginning. And you can understand it. I mean, if I were a policymaker in charge of a major state, that would not be my first go-to. Intelligence is crucial when responding to a terrorist attack. Sometimes governments don't have sufficient intelligence resources. What the United States did, which was absolutely crucial, in some respects more important than anything else it did, was develop a very strong intelligence network that drew an alliance together, particularly against al-Qaeda. And sharing that intelligence enabled all of those countries to have better counterterrorism against al-Qaeda, but that took many years. Another response is to try to cut off the source of financing. The United States did that. They put together counter-financing rules. That requires a fine knowledge of banking and of traditional and untraditional types of financing. The Hawala system, which is basically a barter system, was easy to get around traditional banking. So building that kind of a policy is not easy. Another one is to respond with amnesties or jobs or programs that try to draw people away from being radicalized. And that can also be extremely controversial in the emotional, gut-wrenching aftermath of an attack by people that might be in some way related to those that you're trying to offer jobs to. Counterterrorism is a nuance. It's a type of policy that has a lot of nuance to it. You have to be very calculated rather than emotional to have effective counterterrorism.
We are going to wade into the biggest counterterrorism effort ongoing today, which has provoked an emotional global response on both sides, the ongoing war in Gaza. So, let's set some standards here as we approach this conversation. First, we understand that this current round of fighting predates the past year and has deep roots for people on both sides. Second, we know that Hamas is a terrorist group who has instigated terrorist attacks, ostensibly in the name of the Palestinian people. However, key to note here, we also know that on October 6, 2023, Arab Barometer had conducted surveys in Gaza and the West Bank indicating that Hamas did not have popular support with Palestinians. We have also seen a devastating counterattack by Israeli forces that has drawn condemnation from some parts of the world for its level of death and destruction. This is certainly not an easy conversation for anyone, but it is important to understand the conflict in order to understand how this can come to an end. For the people of Israel and Palestine, it is important that this ends sooner rather than later.
Yeah, that's been really horrible to watch. I mean, the fact that people are now forgetting about what happened on October 7th, there can be two bad things that happen, right? I mean, so 40,000 Palestinians have died in the response. Both of those are horrendous things.
One final thing to note here. We know there are more terrorist groups than Hamas who operate in Gaza, as well as there is a long history of different Palestinian groups using terrorism, going all the way back to at least the 1972 Munich Olympics.
The Palestinian groups have a long history of doing that. What they did with the Munich Olympics massacre is the best classic example. Before 1972, people hadn't really heard of the Palestinians. Nobody gave much attention or time to thinking about what their cause was, and not many people were paying attention to the Palestinian cause. And so in the Munich Olympics massacre, every element of that attack was a big failure. I mean, all 11 of the hostages were killed. Most of the operatives were killed. It was just a big debacle. However, what the Palestinians said afterwards, they said, you offered us a stage and we took it. They had all of those people watching the Olympics. And after the Munich Olympics massacre, according to the interpretation by Palestinian leadership, Black September and other Palestinian subgroups, their cause became globally known. Palestinian terrorist groups, not Palestinian civilians, let me be very clear about that, have used this outrageous, highly advertised types of attacks to draw attention to their cause for decades. And in their opinion, they've been successful.
And bring attention they have. However, it is unclear if this is what they had in mind in terms of global support or lack thereof. There has not been a rallying to their support. The war has not spilled over into other arenas as they may have hoped. But it is undeniable that the desire for attention has been met. However,
the other thing to remember, of course, with Hamas is that Hamas had a whole extensive tunnel system where they put all of their fighters. And what concern did they have for Palestinian civilians? They were up on the surface dying in the tens of thousands. So if Hamas is representing Palestinians, I don't see it. And I think there's an opening there, a relatively easy opening, that the Israelis should have been and should still take advantage of by providing another way for Palestinian civilians. Right now, they have a choice between either alignment with Hamas, which has brought this hell upon them, or having their families killed and destroyed with Israeli bombardment, or having to try to find some safe place within the territory of Gaza, moving from one place to another when there's no safety. And how can you find a way out of this kind of cycle of violence if the people who are the most important potential constituents now and in 10 or 20 years have no other alternative, no sign of hope whatsoever? There needs to be some kind of a political agreement, a political plan. And I don't see that in place thus far.
Throughout this ongoing war, the Israeli government has pursued many of the strategies that Dr. Cronin outlines as ways that terrorist organizations end. Most visibly, they have pursued the military option since the immediate aftermath of the October 7th terrorist attack. They have also pursued negotiation and decapitation. Of course, they are not pursuing victory for Hamas, transformation, or implosion, to round out our six. However, sometimes they've worked at cross purposes in their effort to bring Hamas to an end.
The reason that I'm distressed about the killing of Hania in Iran, Hania had blood on his hands. I'm not trying to imply that I'm sympathetic with the cause that he was promoting. He was the head of the political element of Hamas. But just from a strategic position, the Israelis, having killed the one person that they were in talks with, means that a ceasefire is further away than ever. And don't forget that the Israelis also have hostages who are held in Gaza or wherever they are by Hamas and PIJ and probably other smaller groups. But in any case, the fate of the hostages, I just feel so terrible for those hostage families, because I think that this latest assassination moves the likelihood of a ceasefire agreement further away. And without a deal, you're not going to get the hostages home. There's just no question. That has to be the next step. And the Biden administration has had a ceasefire agreement on the table. And when Benjamin Netanyahu was here speaking before Congress and doing all of his consultations with President Biden and Vice President Harris and also former President Trump, I know that the first two, at least, their consistent message was, we need a ceasefire. We have to get a ceasefire. So it distresses me that the very next thing that happened within days of when Netanyahu returned to Israel was an action that makes a ceasefire less likely.
So, despite the challenges and the animosity swirling around this intractable conflict, there has to be a way this ends. Of course, we do not have a crystal ball over here at the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, so we can only outline what a potential best path forward would be, leaving it up to the leaders to make the right choices.
That's the very first thing, is to get a ceasefire. Longer term, more serious negotiations, I think going through those three phases that were laid out by the Biden administration in their talks that were mediated by the Egyptians and the Qataris. I also think that Hamas is a perfect profile for a group that can end through failure because of loss of popular support. Hamas has never been a popular movement. Immediately after the elections in 2006, and then when they finished taking over in 2007, I think they had something like 62% support on the part of the population within Gaza. But in 2014, the next major signposted time where there was a good ability to take a poll, it was only a third of the Palestinians were supporting Hamas. And since then, it's hard to get good statistics because it's just very difficult to get polling data. The way that the the Hamas regime governs is through a very thuggish, extremely harsh Stasi-style approach, collecting information on their enemies. Very difficult to get good, accurate polling data. However, a series of different types of polls, getting the best information we have, indicates that there's always an increase in support immediately after an attack like the one on October 7th, which is horrendous, but that support tends to decline over time, and this is what has happened. Right now, you can see a lot of anger on the part of many Palestinians toward Hamas for having carried out the October 7th attacks without being concerned about their welfare. What would be the next step? So the first is negotiation, which we're engaged in, and having a ceasefire. And the second major and extremely important approach for that kind of group that's so networked, that's so attached to a territory, is to separate them from their popular support, and they will fail.
This tracks well with the conversation we had in December of 2023 with Arab Barometer, which indicated that on the eve of the October 7th terrorist attack, Palestinians did not have positive views of Hamas. Check out the recording on our website for more. In the end, it is most important that the people of Israel and Palestine are able to live in peace and security. Of course, the solutions are not that simple, but it is clear a new path forward is needed on both sides. Everyone in this complex web of global entanglements should push their respective sides to bring this war to a conclusion and put in real work towards crafting a long-lasting solution. For even if Hamas is defeated or implodes, without changes to the facts on the ground and a new path forward for peace, other groups will spring up to take Hamas's place. In an effort not to make you overly depressed here, Dr. Cronin has some final words of hope to end the conversation with.
The reason I wrote the book was that terrorism can be an extremely depressing topic. I mean, it's all about innocent people getting killed. But the really bright side, the silver lining to that cloud, is that we are getting smarter. We can use these lessons, and we can apply counterterrorism and even changes in our own approach to how we respond to terrorist attacks that can help us survive and even thrive and even prevail. I actually think the story is a positive one. We have this knowledge, we have this set of guidelines. All we have to do is follow them.
Here's to hoping that we can. Thank you for taking the time to listen to The Global in the Granite State, a podcast of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. We hope that you have gained some key insights from this conversation and that we have provided an outline for how the world can move to a better place. These global conversations remain important to our understanding of key issues, as well as our place in the world. Thank you again for your interest. As always, Tim Horgan is your host, director, producer, audio engineer, researcher, etc. for this podcast. Our theme music remains Admin by A.A. Alto, and our interlude music is Traces to Nowhere by Luca Francini. Until next time.